So we've come to another patchwork service here at the church, another service comprised of members and friends sharing stories grounded in a topic related to our monthly theme. This month, our theme is, what does it mean to live a life of awe? Awe can be defined as a feeling of reverential respect mixed with fear or wonder. Several weeks ago, I invited members and friends of our church to reflect upon a time in their lives when they felt awe and to consider sharing their stories with us today. I'm grateful that several said yes, and we're going to be hearing from 6 of them at this service. I'm in awe of their willingness to be vulnerable with us, to share their stories, and I'm grateful that we are in the position to receive these stories. So we're going to sing ourselves into this ritual, we might say. We're going to sing hymn number 402. It's in your gray hymnal. From you I receive, to you I give. And we're going to sing through it twice.
My story is about a young boy I met in my work in the Des Moines School District. For the purpose of this telling, I will call him Ton. Ton and his mother arrived in Des Moines at the end of a journey that included a refugee camp and a stop in another state. Ton was briefly enrolled in school in this other state where he was identified as a student with special needs due to both a physical disability and a communication disability. He was able to walk but was very unsteady. He was able to feed himself with assistance. Ton could not communicate well, even in his native language, knowing only a few words and mainly using sounds and gestures. He did seem to understand what his mother said to him. He arrived at school knowing basically no English. His mother was very young and was working to acclimate herself to life in her new community, to learn English, and to become self-sufficient as quickly as she could. When they first arrived in Des Moines, Ton was enrolled in his neighborhood school. And shortly after that, his mother found a different place to live and they had to move, and he changed schools. He was at his first school for less than a week. After he arrived at his second school, which is where I met him, meetings were held and services were put in place, and we thought we were ready to help him begin his education. There would be many challenges because he was a very young boy whose world and security were his mother. His mother accompanied him to school for the first couple of days. He had trouble with any separation from her and would cling to her and cry. Eventually, she had to go to school herself and was unable to continue coming to school with her son. However, he did have a cousin who rode on the bus with him, and when he arrived at school, he wanted to stay with his cousin, and he would cry and cling to him. His mother moved again outside of our attendance area, but we didn't want Ton to have to change schools a third time. So arrangements were made for a school bus to bring him to our school. Now he was riding on a new bus a long distance to school, and he would arrive in tears, crying and screaming and throwing himself on the ground. He would lash out at those around him, kicking and hitting and trying to claw at those who were trying to help him. This continued for weeks. People who were considered experts at dealing with this kind of disruptive behavior were brought in and new plans were put into place. And we tried a lot of things. For months, he would arrive at school, and it would usually take 2 staff to get him off the bus and into the building. Once in the building, one person would try to prompt him to go to class, and someone else would observe to see if we could figure out what worked and what made the situation worse. We tried singing to him, which we called the Pied Piper approach, and that did not work. We tried taking advantage of built-in classroom bathroom breaks and tried to merge him into the line of kids as they would go back into class, and that worked a couple times. We gave attention to his success and tried to ignore the outbursts and prompted and coached and cajoled. At times, it took him close to 2 hours to go from the bus arrival to his classroom, with lots of crying, screaming, and kicking and commotion during that time. And we wondered, is this ever going to end? And it did. It happened almost overnight that this small boy, who did not speak any language and understood very little of ours, who struggled with a physical disability and other challenges we did not fully understand, overcame his fear. He went from needing adult help to get off the bus to getting off the bus by himself, turning and waving to the bus driver and smiling as he walked into school. He went from taking 2 hours to calm down enough to go into his classroom to making it from the bus to the classroom in less than 2 minutes, with smiles and waves to adults and children he saw along the way. We tried a lot of things. We hung in there and we were patient. We kept him at that school when maybe we could have thought that his new neighborhood school might not be such a bad idea after all. In the end, I believe the transformation was his. He grew and he adjusted. He learned to trust and to work his way through his fear. He started to trust both that we were going to help him and that his mother would be there at the end of the day, at the other end of that bus ride to meet him. Those of us who watched this happen could hardly believe it. We'd send each other messages with the bus to classroom time. 3 minutes, 2 minutes, he's smiling. He waved to the bus driver. We were in awe. A small boy rode the school bus, got off by himself, waved to the bus driver, and walked into the classroom. And we were in awe.
I have the privilege of doing a volunteer internship this year at Project Iowa, which is preparing underemployed and unemployed people with barriers for living in sustainable wage jobs. I'm a member of the VIP team, which stands for Vision, Initiative, and Perseverance, which are all needed in large supply for participants to succeed in this program. The participants are formed into cohorts of 8 to 12, and they come together for weekly classes to learn and develop their emotional intelligence skills. And this positive environment of the learning cohort and the experience of having a team of support builds them up to succeed in all realms of life. The program is amazing in and of itself, but the participants are really awesome. They have the courage to show up, to learn, and to commit themselves to completing the training for a chance at a better life. They're overcoming all kinds of barriers like felony convictions, chronic poverty, reliance on public assistance, substance abuse, lack of education, and language and literacy barriers. Let me tell you about a couple of them. There's a young man, he's only 26 years old. He was out on the mean streets in gang violence, was the victim of a shooting, and ended up in prison himself for a felony conviction. He's now the father of 4 small boys, and he has turned his life around. He does not want those boys to go through what he did, and he wants them to have a good life. He's all about his family now. And there's a young woman who's had a chronic substance abuse problem, but is now turning her life around. She's the mother of a 1-year-old, and when we asked her about who can support her and be her partner in her accountability, she said no one. And we reminded her of her 1-year-old. We said, what about him? He can give high fives, he can praise you, he can build you up just as you build him up. And by the end of that class, we had her encouraged and smiling and really proud of herself as a mom for the future that she's building for herself and her son. Whatever their specific stories, the people we meet have very real obstacles to overcome, and one of the most insidious is a lack of confidence and self-worth that's been a constant drain on their resourcefulness. It's one of the first areas that VIP gets to work on in promoting change. Each participant is encouraged to identify their core values and goals as they develop emotional competencies like motivation and dependability. They practice lifting each other up with praise, known in our group as honks, from the way that geese encourage one another when they fly in formation. The participants can turn to one another for help and acknowledge the gifts that each person brings to the group. I've seen the awesome ways that each person lights up when they are praised by a classmate, and the awe-filled way that they shine when they're given the chance to praise and support one another. The shared experience of identifying their strengths and supporting each other in learning new skills and gaining new awarenesses about themselves builds success upon success, and each step of the process gives them more confidence. By the time that the 12 to 16-week program is finished, they're ready to do an awesome interview presentation with a panel of employers at a workforce showcase for graduates. Seeing them remember or perhaps discover for the first time their own inherent worth and dignity is truly awe-inspiring.
I was the last to board the plane. Getting on last and saying hello to the captain are two of my many tools for flying. After 16 and a half years of not flying and 3 round-trip flights with a companion, I was boarding the plane, alone. I found my seat with butterflies in my stomach and the third tool on the tip of my tongue. I sat down next to the 60-something woman, smiled, and said, "Hi, I'm kind of a nervous flyer, and this is my first time flying alone, and I have to ask a lot of questions and talk. Do you mind if we talk while we're flying?" Really fast, just like that. She smiled and said, "Yes, that's fine." We were quiet for a bit, and my anxiety was getting worse, and I was fidgeting in my seat. "You can hang on to me if you want to, just don't use your fingernails," she said. "Thank you," I said, and we laughed. "I'm Moira." "I'm Susan." "Are you from Des Moines?" "No, I live in Fort Myers, Florida." "Oh, I'm a music director, and I'm going to a UU Music Conference in Dallas." A pause, more fidgeting. "Why are you in Iowa?" I asked. "My brother died." "I'm so sorry." "He died yesterday. I've been with him since last week, and now I'm going home. There was no funeral." Immediately, my focus shifted. Here I am on a plane flying alone for the first time, and the woman beside me, this woman to whom I've sat beside and immediately started rambling to in my anxious state, has just lost her brother. My consciousness expands to encompass more than my fear, and my anxiety ever so slightly gets quieter. I listened studiously to the in case of emergency lesson, and soon the plane was taxiing out onto the runway. Oh, I was getting nervous again, fidgeting in my seat, taking deep breaths. I really don't like the takeoff. I really was thinking I might throw up as the captain said, "We will soon be taking off for Dallas." "Can I hold your hand now?" I asked Susan. "Yes," she said as she reached out her left hand so I could hold it. We didn't talk much as the plane sped up and hurled into the air. Even with Susan's hand, yep, I almost threw up, but I didn't. She could sense I was very uncomfortable. "Can I tell you a story about my brother?" Susan asked, as we were still ascending into the sky and turning to get into our flight path to Dallas. "Yeah, I'd love to hear a story about your brother," I said as I let go of her hand. I can't say that I remember the story about her brother, but I do know that we talked about our families until the attendant came around with the drink cart. I was just fine now. In fact, I was looking forward to watching a movie on my iPod or reading my book. Susan, however, kept talking and telling me more stories about her brother and their time growing up as children. I smiled to myself when we had a lovely conversation during the entire 2-hour flight. As we began the descent, I was fine. In fact, I love landing. Susan turned to me. "Do you want to hold my hand again?" "Yes," I smiled as we both reached out and held hands. As the plane touched down in Dallas, I didn't cry, as was my custom on most landings. I thanked Susan from the bottom of my heart, and before letting go, she looked at me and said, "I hope someday you can hold someone's hand like this." And that's when my tears fell. "Thank you, Susan. I will."
For the past decade, I have served as a substitute teacher in many of the local school systems. Last school year, I decided to apply as a substitute teacher in some of the local Catholic schools as well. Now, I did not grow up in the Catholic Church, nor have I ever attended Catholic churches in any significant ways. So when I was accepted as a substitute teacher in some of the local Catholic schools, I was a bit anxious when I was actually called to teach. Naturally, as I began to substitute in the Catholic schools, I became aware of some of the differences between being a teacher in the Catholic and the public school contexts. The first difference I noticed was kind of the obvious one, all of the religious art, sculptures of Jesus and of Mary in the grounds, and a wide variety of religious art hanging on the walls inside. For me, this artwork created a sense of awe and of mystery that transcended the Catholic Church. I experienced a beauty, a love, a treasuring message that emanated from the art, a message that I believe would be palpable even to those who do not know the story presented in the art itself. Another difference that I noticed from the students was they seemed to have a greater sense of respect for adults, certainly for members of the priesthood, and I would add for teachers. On 3 occasions when I substituted, a priest or a monsignor walked into the classroom that I was substituting in for an unannounced and an informal conversation with the students. Upon noticing the entrance of their church leaders, each and every student, unprompted by me, as I did not know the guest was coming and I certainly didn't know the protocol, each and every student immediately stopped what they were doing, stood up, and became silent. The students then waited to sit down until they were granted permission to do so. After sitting, the students respectfully, openly, willingly engaged in a conversation with the priest or the monsignor for about 30 minutes. Later, fellow teachers told me that any topic was fair game for these conversations. Last school year, I participated in an all-elementary school enactment of the Rosary. On this day, I was substituting in a 4th grade classroom. Not having experience in participating in a group rosary event, I was certainly anxious. I did not know what to expect. While the school provided rosaries for all of the students, some of the students asked to go to their lockers to get their personal rosaries, which of course I allowed. When these students returned, I could tell that they treasured their rosaries by the reverent way in which they held them. By asking, I learned that these rosaries were gifts given by family members on special occasions in their lives. On this day, the 4th grade class that I taught happened to be the last class to enter the gymnasium. When I entered, I was astounded by what I found. There were over 100 students sitting in perfect silence. This was a silence coming out of what I perceived to be an interior sense of awe of the holy, out of the fledgling devotion of the students themselves. During the enactment, the students were sitting in the shape of a rectangle, following the contours of the gym, facing each other. Each class, in turn, stood up and led a part of the rosary. There were responses that all of the students knew by heart, knowing what to say and exactly when to say it. When the rosary enactment was over, class by class, the students left in silence. A sacred, complete, voluntary silence that they continued as they walked back their classrooms. They maintained it in the hallway, and if my 4th grade class was any indication, into the classroom itself as well. I experienced awe, not only from the Rosary event itself, but perhaps even more from the reverent participation of the students. As compared to my students and experiences in the public schools, I was in awe to witness elementary students so greatly appreciate and know how to participate in silence and in ritual. About a month ago, I substituted in a Catholic middle school that I have been to multiple times last year and again this year. As part of the morning routine, each day a different student would lead what they called morning prayer. The leader would read a meditation that included passages from the Bible. There would be a liturgy, including responses from the class, which they knew, and a concluding time of prayer. During the prayer, each student who would choose, and most did, said something that they would like remembered by their classmates. Quite simple stuff, really. Family birthdays, events of all kind that the students were participating in, prayers for their absent teacher, and prayers that their sick family members or sick class members would be well. After many times of not participating in this prayer time, on this occasion, in spite of myself, I found that I was drawn into participating. I shared with the students that I was attending a small group at my church, Soul Matters, for the first time, and that I was a bit anxious about how it might go. The next day, I substituted in the same classroom, and during prayer time, I told the class that the group, again, meaning Soul Matters, went way better than I would have dared to imagine. Participating in the prayer with my students made me feel and view myself as more at one with my students. Indeed, it contributed to changing my view of the teacher-student relationship itself. Through reflecting upon these cumulative experiences in the Catholic schools, experiences of watching children participate in faith formation activities and participating vicariously beside them as an observer and as a novice, indeed even more of a novice than the children themselves, I realized slowly that what I was experiencing was profound. What I realized is that these experiences in the Catholic Church schools were helping me to gain an access to my own youth again, the important time when I learned and formed my own childlike faith. These experiences were helping me to peel back the layers of my adult religious education like a holy onion, and they were helping me to revisit my time of an innocent, trusting, accepting faith. I am in awe that I had these experiences within the context of the Catholic schools. I would never have imagined that this could happen. I am in awe of how the wholly unexpected can pay a visit in my life, opening and healing me in ways that I knew needed opening and healing, but did not even know to imagine could be possible.
As some of you know, I'm a biologist. What few, if any of you know, is I used to be a hunter as well. The first Mrs. Allen, our 5 small children and I rented a small farm south of Washington, Iowa. With our brood and my underemployment, we decided that if I could supply a few free meals, we might have enough income left over to take the kids to a movie once in a while. So off I would set, like Paul Ingalls, to brave the wilds of southeast Iowa, to bring back sustenance for my family. At least that's how I told myself it went. In truth, I wandered about toting an old .22 rifle, hoping for a distracted critter to wander into my sights and thus into the stew pot. With my hunting prowess, most of my hunts actually were delightful walks in the fresh air with little danger of it to any beast. Squirrels, little chance. Pheasants, never even close. But with time, I came to be better at hunting rabbits than anything else. They were numerous. They bred like, well, you know. And with fuddy and determination, I could get one every third try or so. This went on for a few years. Then my employment drastically improved with a position at the University of Iowa. Though it no longer had the same need, I had come to enjoy and look forward to hunting season. This particular Saturday, I was up just about sunrise. It's my favorite time. A fresh snow had fallen the night before, yet the sky was now clear. A yellow-orange winter sun was peeking through the bare trees. The temps were in the low 20s. Perfect hunting weather. I cradled the old .22 as I loaded it and dropped an extra box of ammo into my pocket. Always the optimist. I hadn't been out long when I crested the rim of a draw and saw a rabbit dart away from a nearby blackberry bush. I froze. After a few seconds, the rabbit stopped and stood up to see if anything was chasing it. That's the moment I was waiting for. The rifle popped with a satisfying nudge in my shoulder. The rabbit simply slumped over. When I got to the rabbit, he was lying there as if asleep. It was even hard to tell where the bullet had hit him. I picked up his body. I thanked God for this gift, and I thanked the rabbit for his sacrifice. But as I looked into his eye, a still, quiet thought revealed itself. This is the result of 3.6 billion years of life. This small body, as with all living things, represents a timeline uninterrupted since the beginning of Earth. And you ended it. The awesome weight of all that time and responsibility tipped the balance within me. Life took on a whole new meaning. I think this was the first time I got a glimpse of what it meant to be at one with all living things. I never hunted again. I just didn't enjoy it. I still go for delightful walks in the fresh air, but when I see an animal, I just watch with wonder.
I'm reminded of my first visit to Madrid, Iowa, which is when I realized that I lived in a world that was not as I thought it was. I was in college at the time, so I was probably about 19 or 20, and I probably thought I had a lot more figured out than I had any right to. I grew up in the Chicagoland area all my life, so most of my formative experiences were there. One of my friends was from Iowa, and she invited a few of us to come along when she went to visit her parents for the weekend. While I know more than a few city people who would question how enjoyable a trip to Iowa could possibly be, this was my first major road trip with friends and my first experience of rural America. It really was a different place compared to what I was used to, and I was enjoying the novelty of it all. I was given a quick tour of the town, which included learning about the sole stoplight at their biggest intersection. The backyard was bordered by the field that they kept their 2 horses in on one side and their neighbor's cornfield on another. They had a giant apple tree, and there was plenty of space. And it was so quiet. There were no traffic, there was no sirens, just insects and birds. There were no tall buildings that get in the way of the view of the sky, and the nearest house was probably acres away, and I was even measuring things in acres by the end of it. The weekly local newspaper had headlines about what students were accomplishing at their school or what one neighbor made for dinner that night, a stark contrast to what I was used to in Chicago, which was more likely to feature stories about who was murdered or indicted in a scandal that day. But nothing prepared me for the night my friend's sister took me outside, told me where to stand, away from the nearby trees and house, and said, "Okay, now look up." I literally said, "Whoa." It was a clear night in July, and without the light pollution from Chicago, the stars were incredibly gorgeous. The sky was so clear. In fact, she told me what I thought was a cloudy area ruining an otherwise perfect view was in fact a band of the Milky Way that was visible. I have never seen the stars that way before, and it was an amazing sight. What really surprised me, though, was discovering that the constellations I've read about and seen pictures of were so huge and took up so much space in the sky. I had no idea. For years I thought they were tiny, that the stars clumped together so tightly, and I just couldn't make them out in the Chicago sky. And growing up, I was fascinated with the concept of constellations, but I never understood how people from a long time ago could possibly identify certain clusters of them and say these were this arbitrary constellation here is like some guy holding a club. It seemed like interesting trivia, but I couldn't make it out. I tried, and I hadn't paid attention to the sky in years as a result. I never really bothered to get a telescope because I figured it would just be larger versions of tiny things I couldn't see. But seeing the Big Dipper and realizing that it takes up such a large percentage of the sky made me realize that the constellations are now not only still fascinating, but they're right in front of me. I was humbled. I was in awe as I studied the sky, simultaneously soaking in the view and thinking about recognizable configurations from books, wondering what I had forgotten. I was seeing it as it really is for the first time, with its great and distant balls of gas twinkling as if they were winking at me that I was finally let in on the secret. I was so wrong about it, and I was so happy that I was. To this day, I still enjoy regularly taking time to look up into the night sky in Des Moines on a clear night, appreciating the beauty and scale of it all.
Most people who know me haven't heard this story, and I guess that most of them would be surprised to hear this type of story coming from me, but it does seem to fit the bill for an awesome story that Mark wanted. When I was younger, during my high school years, I had the opportunity to live 4.5 years in Mexico City, Mexico. My father worked for an international division of General Tire and Rubber Company out of Akron, Ohio. He was a production chemist, and it was his job to teach the rubber formulas to the native Mexicans so they could. Each Sunday afternoon after church and lunch, we would usually have some sort of family outing. On the particular Sunday that I'm going to tell you about, my father, mother, sister, and I walked over from our house on Rio Niagara Street in Colonial Cuauhtemoc, past the Statue of Independence, and took in a movie in the tourist area. I don't even remember what the movie was, since the occurrences once we left were so dynamic as to completely obliterate everything else that happened that day. It was getting dark when we emerged from the theater and began our walk home. All of a sudden, we noticed that people around us were all stopping and looking up at the sky behind us. We turned around to see what they were looking at and were amazed to see a bright light descending in the evening sky. As it got closer, it seemed to resemble the flying saucer images that many of us had seen in movies like E.T., The Extraterrestrial, or Encounters of the Third Kind. The lights were glowing and blinking, brightening up the entire sky, and there was an audible whirring sound. Other people, out for the evening, started walking out into the street, word of the event seemingly spreading as additional people came from storefronts, hotels, restaurants, and of course, all of the people who had been in the movie with us. Walking down the street, and even those who were driving by in taxis or cars stopped. There were well over a few hundred people or more standing there watching the approaching disc as it descended, and for all those people there, it was so quiet that you could hear a pin drop. I might even say we were all speechless in awe. When the object that we were all watching reached about 50 feet from the ground, its speed slowed, and it hovered slightly in front and above the crowd that had gathered. Then after hovering about 2 minutes, it suddenly took off and zipped away back into the sky. Everyone watching was breathless and in shock, mostly because we had all together witnessed the same extraordinary thing. This was well before cell phones, but there are always police nearby in Mexico City. Reports were taken, and the incident was reported the next day in the newspapers as an unexplained sighting of a perceived flying saucer. As to what this incident may have taught me or how it changed my life, especially because I can tell you other tales of strange happenings while I lived in the land once populated by Aztecs and Mayans. Since that day, I have never doubted that other life may exist in or beyond this universe of ours. My sister was quite young at the time and doesn't recall a thing about this event. My mother disavowed the sighting and would become upset if anyone spoke of it, so we didn't talk about it in her presence. Now, my father, the scientist, it was a different story. He had made sure we all saw the first Sputnik and followed the space program quite religiously. This man, who had married my divorced mother and adopted me at a 1.5-year-old, was responsible, very intelligent, quiet, and a man of few words. Having a close father-daughter relationship wasn't always easy. This event we had been through together became something that bonded us together. Many years later, when he was in Des Moines at the Veterans Hospital for a final diagnosis of ALS, he and I had lots of time by ourselves. I was a grown woman by then, and we had been apart for many years. He living in Mexico, traveling on to Tanzania and Romania for General Tire, while I was at the University of Iowa for college and then establishing my own family. After situating him in the hospital, my mother had returned to Mount Ayr, where they lived in retirement, to tend to their business, the town laundromat. It was my job to visit and spend time with Dad and talk to the doctors while he was hospitalized and report back to Mom. Well, we talked about that time in Mexico and what we had witnessed, how it was so remarkable. After several weeks in Des Moines, he returned home and passed away soon afterwards. His ALS was such that it quickly attacked the muscles of his lungs so that he lost the ability to breathe. The strange and awesome sighting years previous was able to bring us back together for some of the closest conversations that I can recall ever having with him. A one-time awesome event became a cherished, long-lasting memory of a common experience between a father and his daughter.
My body still carries sense memories of the house that was my family's home for the first 18 years of my life. I remember seeing my hands on those maple kitchen cupboards, feeling that warm, dusty balcony wood on my feet, hearing the hum of power tools echoing up the laundry chute from my dad's workshop, tasting the walnuts warmed and cracked by that limestone fireplace. And I remember smelling that distinctive smell that greeted me every time I crossed the threshold of that front door. A pleasant and mysterious blend of all of the familiar people and objects that filled up that house. It smelled like home. When my family moved from that little ranch house on the hill, when I could only come to that threshold as a stranger, I felt lost, disoriented, like a stranger to myself. Losing home, the place that belongs to us and to which we belong, tears down something we may not have even realized we've been building day by day while occupying a place for a period of time. When that place and time ends, we scatter like ants in a storm, and then we start to rebuild it again. My students stake out a particular spot in the room on the first day of class each semester and return to it every single time. My kids claim certain seats in my car as their own. My dad always slept on the same side of the bed and sat in the same chair at the dinner table. We long for familiar places, so we familiarize ourselves with them. We and places become familiars. Like witches and black cats, home is our companion, and home is our demon. We make places home because home places us. We keep searching for home because we find ourselves there, and we lose ourselves when home is eventually gone, because no matter how carefully we create home, it can't last. Familiar places can't stay forever, and neither can their people. Places leave us. Semesters end, cars are sold, beds and chairs wear out. We leave places. My dad's favorite bed and chair are strangely full of his absence now. If we know that home can't stay and that we can't stay home, why do we return to that favorite corner of that favorite coffee shop or to that familiar building with the faces that we know on Sunday? Why do we even start searching for home? I saw all of my babies dislodged from their first home, wet and naked and cold, to be wrapped in soft blankets, held in strong arms, rocked in brightly colored rooms, initiated into practices of homemaking. But what is this home we are making? Home is that perfectly familiar place that is to shield us from the extremes of wonder and fear. But it fills me with wonder and fear, with awe nonetheless. Maybe it's really the practice of making home that we need even more than the place. Maybe we need to leave home just so we can find it again. Maybe homemaking is just what we need to do. Maybe homemakers are just what we are.
You know that essay we're all supposed to write when we return to school in the fall? The one that starts, "What I did for my summer vacation?" Well, for my summer vacation, I served as a chaplain intern at Iowa Methodist Hospital in Des Moines. This kind of experience is required of UU seminarians and for many other faith traditions. In my summer group were 2 Lutherans, a Catholic, and a Presbyterian. I am 20 years older than the second eldest in the group, and I was the only non-Christian. Let's just say that I started my adventure feeling a little like one of these things is not like the other. While working with patients and their families, I didn't always see compassion. Sometimes we human beings just don't go there. For some, the not going there happens for generations. I could see that the minute I encountered families in trauma. Some would ignore other family members. Comments that were blaming were common. Stress brings out a lot of this among fragile families. For some, though, in the midst of great tragedy, it is different. Late one night, maybe closer to 2 a.m, I was sleeping in the on-call room. The pager went off, sending me to the critical care unit. The nurse told me he was dying and that the family could use support. I had to muster courage and strength. I'm tired. I'm scared. I walked through the door of the room. It was not a pretty sight. A woman in her early 60s bending over the bed, holding the unconscious man's hand. On the other side of the bed, in his 40s, a man leaned in towards the dying man. He spoke softly, too, a great sadness on his face. But something struck me as I moved into the room, like a force or a change in air pressure. I felt it envelop me, giving me something I had not asked for nor expected. I was struck by all the love in the room. It's not that the sadness went away. It didn't. The dying man was laboring to breathe. His wife told me he had suffered with lung cancer for the last year, but they weren't expecting him to go like this. He collapsed at home. She held my hand, welcoming me further into the love that was surrounding these tender people. His son was encouraging. "It's okay, Dad. We love you. You don't have to stay. We understand." He reached over and pulled up the gown on his father's chest, just a little up to preserve his dignity, to tenderly care for him in the only way he could. I was moved by the gesture, a loving touch. And I've seen this touch over and over again. They told me about him, how they enjoyed their time with him, what he liked to do. They were in tears. I felt my knees go weak as I could see their grieving begin in earnest. And I was grateful for them, that they had the love that allows a rich and uncomplicated grieving. I offered a prayer of comfort, a prayer of peace and gratitude. When the pastor from their home congregation arrived, I prepared to leave. The woman turned to me and hugged me. She hugged me. She had let me in. I was honored. I was blessed by their compassion and the transcendence that was inherent in their relationship. I was astounded by all the love in the room, and I was in awe.